Warning: this video contains stories that some might find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. I'm a former funeral director. My partner and I had just gotten back to the funeral home from a house call for a 31-year-old woman who died of cancer. As we were moving her body from the cot to embalming table, we heard an audible click, and the radio across the room turned on full volume of static. It's one of those old radios you turn the volume dial until it clicks to turn it on. We both looked at each other. He was an extremely religious man, and this event visibly shook him, and he left not long after the incident. I shut the radio off as I typically used my phone to listen to music while embalming, when I'd finished the procedure and was attempting to move her from the embalming table to a dressing table. I heard that click from that old radio, and it turned on full volume yet again. At that point, I was fairly freaked out and made my exit not long after. My partner and I never spoke of it again, and nothing like that ever occurred to my knowledge before or after. When I was in college, I worked part-time at a Jewish cemetery in reception. The cemetery was closed from Friday afternoon through Saturday evening for Sabbath. We sometimes stayed a bit later in the office on Friday afternoons to get bills out or checks processed. We heard a loud commotion by the cemetery entrance, which was locked, and only staff could get in and out. The office manager went to see what was going on and made me come with her. We went down to the gate to find an older woman who was probably around 70 begging us to let her in. She was dressed to the nines, and she kept saying she needed to get back. This was in the suburbs of New Jersey, so you needed a car to get around, but we didn't see a car or anything. She was just there in this beautiful black dress. We couldn't open the gate without the cemetery manager, so we went to go get him. We brought him back to the gate, and just like that, no one was there. We looked at video footage of the entrance, and you could see the office manager and me talking, but there was no one on the other side of the gate. The cemetery manager thought we were trying to trick him. I swear to this day, we saw a woman in a fancy dress outside that gate. There were multiple cameras, and not a single one picked up anyone on the other side of the gate, even though you could see the whole gate on the footage. I don't know if it was a ghost or what. The office manager and I decided not to tell anyone else, but we would mention it to each other every once in a while. I work at a graveyard, and I just have one thing to say. Plastic. Here in Norway, graves are protected by law for 20 years, but after that, the spots can be reused. Usually a grave is fine to reopen after 20 years because the body is supposed to be decomposed and pretty much gone. Now back to plastic. Between the 50s and 80s, it was common here to be buried in plastic to minimize smell and leakage. I'm sure they thought it was a good idea back then. But once we started reusing graves in Norway, we realized it is a curse. A lot of bodies are wrapped in plastic, and I myself have seen one and what was supposed to be a burial at a reused site. The body was about 50 or 60 years old and should be basically gone. But nope, it was not. The plastic wrap it was covered with kept the body from decomposing, and it's basically just been marinated in its own juices for more than half a century. The smell was awful, and the sight was even worse. I'm sure this is not the kind of paranormal story you wanted, but it's honestly the most horrific and bizarre thing I've ever been part of. It kind of looked really human still, which was disturbing considering it was really old. You could see skin and hair among other things, but it was a soggy mess, and you could see fluids around the body like it was a person bathing. I don't usually deal with dead bodies directly. I'm a grave gardener and help decide which graves to reuse, so I ran off to puke pretty quickly. My colleagues cremated her with the plastic still wrapped around her. Nobody dared trying to take it off because of the smell and the juices. Funeral director here. One of our workers cleaned up after everyone had left from a wake. It was about 10 p.m. and he heard footsteps from the visitation room. He went there to check and saw through the door one last guest walking around. It was a well-dressed old man walking with his cane. Our worker went to help escort the gentleman out when he discovered no one was in there. The man just disappeared, and the sound of footsteps was gone too. He then came back into the office, told us the story, and described the visitor. He suddenly went pale as he identified the man in a photo we had at the funeral home. It was my grandfather who had recently passed. The funeral home is a family business, and he's the former director. My dad purchased a cemetery when I was in middle school, and I worked for him through high school graduation. I did yard work like mowing, weed eating, flower beds, etc. I had seen occasional shadows out of the corner of my eye and people who turned out to not be there. Also heard strange sounds at times. Aside from these, the cemetery was actually quite a peaceful place. But the strangest is when you have a burial in the crypts. Basically, you dig down about 4 or 5 feet to expose giant cement doors. You pull the cement doors off and drop down into a little room. These rooms can fit 2 coffins or years and years worth of cremated remains. So, back in the 50s and 60s, families would buy one crypt and the entire fam would be cremated and put in it. Some just put the cremated remains in it and close her up, but others light candles and leave flowers and souvenirs like pictures and toys. It's extremely creepy opening up one of those cement doors after 50 years and finding melted candles and old pictures of the people inside. Plus, when you hop down in there, you have a weird realization that you are at the same level and completely surrounded by bodies. My best friend and I worked at a cemetery as groundskeepers when we were in high school. It was easy money. That was the late 1970s, and we got paid $5 an hour mostly for trimming and keeping the graves tidy. We raked a lot of leaves and we tore around the place in a souped-up golf cart with our tools in backs. It was annoying to work in the rain, and it rained often, but it was truly a gravy job. No pun intended. There were a lot of dead flowers to remove, and a lot of empty liquor bottles, beer cans, and used condoms. There was a widow who left scribbled notes torn from her notebook upon her husband's grave, all of them completely illegible. Also, there were a lot of sodden, stuffed animals that were sometimes very muddy on the graves of children. The creepiest thing I saw was a baby doll that was burnt as if someone had gone over it lightly with a blowtorch. It also had a multitude of big nails driven into its head. I kept the head and hung it from my rearview mirror like a graduation tassel. The worst thing I saw was the naked corpse of a young woman my age, a student at a neighboring high school. She was left neatly with her arms at her sides one foggy Saturday morning. She had been strangled right there. Whoever murdered her had also punched her in the face several times before she was dead. She was identified quickly, but her clothes were never found, and her murder was never solved. My friend and I were grilled by the police over several sessions, but what the hell? We didn't know anything. My friend quit a couple of weeks later. I hung on until I turned 18 when I was eligible to work in my uncle's printing plant. I'll never forget the bruises and her open, dead blue eyes. I used to do some odd jobs at the 12th century graveyard in my hometown. It was built in the mid-1300s, as in the church and its surrounding graveyard had been in continuous use for at least that long. When you keep burying bodies in the same small patch of ground for that many centuries, eventually the soil has been turned over dozens of times and consists mainly of bone fragments. You can't even plant flowers there without accidentally uncovering some teeth or finger bones or something. It's nothing but fragmented skeletons all the way down under the thin turf. The soil sort of resembles seaside shell sand, except on closer examination. All the light-colored bits are bone fragments rather than crushed seashells. Not really scary or unexpected, just a bit eerie until you get used to it. You learn to treat anything recognizable as human remains with respect, and you just tuck them away out of sight under the plant or whatever else you were putting there.